Good morning and good afternoon. I am thrilled to welcome you to the How Emerging Technologies and the Pandemic Are Shaping Parking Demand, Supply, and Policy. I'm Becky Steckler, the Program Director at Urbanism Next. And we've got a really great lineup today. And as I told my nephew, who was starting graduate school in a planning program at Portland State University, when he's ready to start talking about parking, that I was available for him. It feels like so much of the work that we do eventually comes back to parking. And I think the interest in this particular webinar really speaks to that. So at Urbanism Next, we study how emerging technologies impact city form and development. And when I first started doing this work about 4 years ago, I thought, if we're taking scooters and bike share and Ubers and Lyfts and eventually autonomous vehicles, or just ordering a bunch of goods to be delivered through Amazon, that this was what our parking lots eventually were going to look like before maybe we actually redeveloped them. That the demand for parking would really go down as we took different alternatives to getting ourselves and our goods around. But what I realized that, of course, the conversation isn't quite that simple. And some research that my colleagues have done, Ben Clark and Ann Brown, really made me understand that some of the principles of induced demand, that if we continue to build abundant free parking, and if it's the most convenient and least expensive option, that people will continue to drive and park. But if we don't, if we increase the cost of parking, either through making it more expensive or limiting the supply or just making it much less convenient, then that is when you actually start to see those modes change, and our options for how we get places that we still really want to get to really start to change then. So there's definitely a mobility need and a need to move people and goods, and how much it costs in large part is going to determine, which mode we take. So just a real brief introduction. I'm excited to hand it over to the specialists who know a lot more about this than me. I'm going to be your moderator today. But we're going to start it off with Matt Norris. He is the director of the Building Healthy Places initiative at the Urban Land Institute, and he was one of the primary authors of the recently published Parking Policy Innovations in the United States. Matt's going to start with a bit of a refresher on the parking fundamentals, and then he's going to focus on off-street parking and how local governments are thinking about parking policies and how developers are thinking about market demand and supply in the developments that they're building. After Matt, we're going to turn it over to Chrissy Mancini Nichols, and she's the National Director of Curb Management and New Mobility at Walker Consultants. She's going to move us back onto the street and onto on-street parking demand and discuss how that is changing. Historically, the vast majority of on-street parking has been dedicated to long-term parking uses. But Chrissy's going to show the results of just some of the studies she's been working on that really start to quantify the demand for more and more varied short-term uses. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Matt. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Becky. And I'll just pull up my slides here. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Great. So hello again to everyone. I'm so excited to be here today for this discussion on parking demand, supply, and policy. So again, as Becky mentioned, I'm Matt Norris. I work for the Urban Land Institute's Building Healthy Places initiative. And for those of you who may not know ULI, we're a research and membership organization with over 45,000 members worldwide, all working in various aspects of real estate and land use. And at the Building Healthy Places initiative specifically, we work to leverage our member and partner networks to shape projects and places in ways that improve the health of people and communities. And our overarching goal is to make health and social equity considerations mainstream in real estate practice. So part of our work at the Building Healthy Places initiative involves research and learning from our members about parking policy reform at the city level, and also how parking provision and real estate development intersect with health, sustainability, livability, and housing affordability goals. So getting started today, I thought it would be helpful to take a look at some recent headlines addressing parking demand, supply, and policy from this year. And with the growth of outdoor dining and changes in commuting patterns and shopping habits during the pandemic, as well as other recent trends, it's really clear that we're all trying to make sense of what's next for transportation and parking policy, as Becky alluded to. So all of the headlines you see here are from just the past few months. And as probably everyone here knows, parking is always a hot button issue, but it's potentially become even more of one since the start of the pandemic. So on one hand, the New York Times said that the fight over parking in New York is like the Hunger Games. And this specific article goes on to share that free street parking in New York City has become increasingly scarce. Outdoor dining took over roughly 10,000 parking spaces, and car ownership in the city has soared. But at the same time, you see here that Dallas Magazine has been talking about how the city of Dallas is considering major parking reform, potentially eliminating parking minimums. And the Indy Star has been covering new zoning changes in Indianapolis focused on new development creating less parking around their growing BRT system. So really, the conversation is a mixed picture. So the questions are, are cities, developers, and others going to push for more parking? Or are some longer term trends that predate the pandemic, including growing demand for parking policy reform and more efficient use of the existing parking supply, going to win out? It's an open question, but I think it's important to put the parking conversation in context. There is a ton of parking supply in our country. And in fact, there are an estimated 2 billion parking spaces in the US, but only about 250 million cars. And so we're talking about 8 parking spaces per car. On top of that, recent trends show that the use of parking spaces for automobile storage, for car parking, has generally been going down, and demand for car light lifestyles is high. Some models have predicted a reduction in overall demand of between 10 and 40% over the next few decades due to technological advancements like autonomous vehicles. And then ULI research also shows that more than half of people in the US and 63% of millennials want to live in a place where they don't need to use a car very often. At the same time, more and more cities have overhauled their parking policies in recent years. In 2017, Buffalo became the first major US city to eliminate parking minimum requirements citywide. In 2020, the city of Dunwoody, Georgia, an Atlanta suburb, approved a zoning policy update that transformed its former minimum required parking ratios to maximum parking caps for most uses. Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside of DC, allows development proposals for projects with more than one use to reduce the total number of parking that's built by submitting a shared parking analysis instead of using the county's usual parking requirement formula. And this is increasingly common in many other cities as well. That's just one example. And Santa Monica adopted an unbundled parking provision through a zoning update in 2015 with the goal of preventing the cost of parking from being passed on to those who don't own automobiles. And their policy requires off-street parking spaces to be sold or leased separately from the purchase or lease of new residential units. And it applies to buildings with 4 or more dwelling units. So again, these are just a few quick examples, and there are obviously many, many more, probably from the cities that you're joining us from today. So in fact, as Becky mentioned, ULI has been collecting information on various parking policy reforms across the US in a report at the address you see above, and I can share this in the chat later as well. Our interactive report includes a searchable, filterable database with a range of recent policy examples. And I just want to state that the resource truly is a work in progress, and we would love for you to help us add to it. So instructions on how to submit policies to potentially be included on the site are included on the site, and we would love to crowdsource this information, and we'll be updating it periodically with new information. So why is all of this happening now? What are some of the trends that have been influencing city parking policy reforms? Well, first, cities are really recognizing that outdated parking requirements promote development patterns that can increase traffic congestion, can contribute to air pollution, raise housing costs, prevent walkability, and also penalize those without automobiles. Changing shopping preferences are leaving acres of parking lots at many shopping malls vacant. And some of these changes really have been accelerated even more by the pandemic. Historically high construction costs are contributing to housing unaffordability all across the country, especially when the high costs of building on-site parking are factored in. Advances in technology are promoting more efficient management of the existing parking supply, and including by using information technology that shares the location of available spaces and supports real-time dynamic pricing. And then the popularity of walking, bicycling, and shared micromobility services has been reducing the need for individuals to own and park cars. And quickly, I think it's really important not to understate the transformative potential of micromobility on space devoted to automobile storage. By accommodating micromobility vehicles, including dockless scooters and bikes, on-site developers in a growing number of cities are able to reduce the number of automobile parking spaces that they're required to provide. And the data really backs up this strategy as good policy, especially because over a third of trips using shared micromobility have been shown to replace a car trip. So in response to these trends, cities are increasingly recognizing that too much parking can be harmful for local quality of life, but also for the bottom line. So in fact, parking often earns only 7 to 42% of the tax revenues earned by other land uses. And it's important to note that this really limits funds that can be used to tackle the challenges of the day, including housing attainability and the need to invest in urban resilience. It's also important to note that strategies like eliminating parking minimums or allowing or requiring shared or unbundled parking can serve to lower real estate development costs, and in fact may even allow funds that would otherwise have been used to provide off-street parking to be devoted to community benefits or to revenue generating project amenities. So, building less parking can significantly improve a project's financial performance, and developers are increasingly recognizing this. And this is because providing parking can be one of the most expensive budget items in a project pro forma, often anywhere between 10 to 18% of a typical building development cost. And the cost of providing parking, really isn't just a factor in development project profits, although that does often drive decision making. It's often it's also really a clear equity issue. So being forced to provide excess parking creates land use patterns that limit walkability and produces negative environmental consequences. These consequences are often disproportionately borne by those with lower incomes who are less likely to own a personal automobile. So building less parking can reduce the cost of building new housing and can allow for more efficient land use. So as an example, studies have shown that including a garage parking space adds an average of 17% to units rent. And at the same time, being able to charge separately for parking can reduce housing costs. So back to my original question of what's next, and really the theme of this webinar. What will the long-lasting trends be when it comes to parking, given the changes that were brought on by the pandemic, including increased work from home and other technological advances? Well, again, it really is an open question, and I'm sure most of you have also been pondering this, but what does the data say? Well, first of all, it's true that car ownership has recently increased, and according to a study last year from McKinsey, new light vehicle registrations reached a 10-year high last March. But at the same time, micromobility and walking and bicycling have also been gaining ground. What about changes to the public realm brought on by the pandemic? Well, we've also seen evidence that some cities are working to make previously temporary changes permanent, although perhaps not as many as you'd expect. I'm guessing many of you may have seen a study last year from Boston University that found that a third of mayors were planning to make expansions to outdoor dining, including in former car parking spaces, permanent. But only 6% planned for streets that they had closed to automobile traffic to create space for walking, bicycling, and exercise to be permanent. So the picture is mixed, but what about developers and investors? What are they saying? Well, ULI surveyed our members in various markets last fall to explore the factors that land use professionals consider when determining the amount of parking to build. And I've included two sort of like opposing responses from San Jose as an example here. So you can see them on your screen. Although some developers felt that projects without on-site parking would not be viable in the long term, others were hopeful that pandemic era shifts to a higher demand for driving and parking would really be more of a blip than a trend. And that, they also felt the continuing spending on unused parking was clearly bad for cities and also bad for their bottom line. So these kind of two, opposing sentiments were actually fairly evenly split. Our surveys also found that there is significant, although definitely not universal, belief among the real estate industry that new mobility options can support projects with limited or no on-site parking. And perhaps surprisingly, it was surprising to me, there seems to be faith that projects with access to shared mobility, bicycling routes, micromobility, can have even more of an impact on supporting lower parking amounts than proximity to transit. And this quote here from a banker shows a growing sentiment that micromobility access can drive successful projects with less parking. And it really is in a project's best interest to build the lowest amount of parking the market will accept. So those survey responses, those were from last fall, but what about today? Well, we haven't been able to go back to survey our members at ULI again on this question specifically yet, but anecdotally, I've been hearing from ULI members and others that calls for increased parking that have been brought on by the pandemic, again, really may have been more of a blip than a trend. So on this point, a recent article from BizNow focused on the increase in private automobile ownership in New York City specifically. And a lot has been made about this. It's New York City after all. And in fact, it's true. Between August and October last year, car ownership rates in the city did increase by 40%. And again, this is anecdotal, but this quote here on your screen from the article is really aligned with what many of our members have been saying, that over time, car ownership will again decline. And it's in cities and developers and property owners' best interests to limit new car parking and to make more efficient use of the spaces that we already have. Before moving on, just a quick note on a question I often hear, which is, but even if developers want to build less parking, won't the banks require more? Well, again, unfortunately, the answer to that question is somewhat complicated. We've seen through our surveys that lenders and investors, they really don't control parking decisions for development projects, but many of their investment decisions may in fact be influenced by the amount of parking included in a project. So, according to our surveys, lenders and investors generally don't require developers to build a specific amount of parking. By the time development projects are looking for funding, most of the time decisions on how much parking to include have already been made. But there are definitely exceptions to this, and lenders and investors do factor parking into their decisions on loan amounts and other lending and investing terms. So as you can see here with the quotes on your screen, a lender that answered our survey shared that they would never require a developer to build additional parking above what's included in approvals. But that being said, another response from a lender showed that banks may factor parking into decisions about loan amounts and terms. So there really isn't much evidence that developers are drastically increasing parking amounts after they plan projects due to the influence of banks. But some developers likely do build a little bit more parking than they would have otherwise to be more competitive for financing in certain markets. So since ULI members, many ULI members are developers, I wanted to share a quick case study of a project that's partially completed, that's including significantly less parking than traditional ratios in a suburban location. The project's Kirkland Urban. It's a redevelopment project of a 1980s strip center in Kirkland, Washington, which is a suburb of Seattle. The project includes a mix of office space, retail, apartments, and a movie theater. And the mixed use nature of the development created an opportunity for shared parking, since actual parking demand in a mixed use project varies significantly by use, by the time of day, the day of the week, and by season. So for this project, for Kirkland Urban, if the developers had not explored shared parking, they would have been required by code to provide 3,747 spaces for the project in total. The developer hired a parking consultant to explore a shared parking arrangement, which projected a maximum peak parking demand of 2,287 spaces at full build out. So they went with that amount instead. So 2,287 spaces it's still a lot of parking, but it's also a difference of nearly 1,500 spaces between the general code required amount and the projected demand. And this represents a cost savings of almost $66 million in development costs. So the shared parking arrangement resulted in a ratio across the project of 1.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet. That's not as low as a downtown ratio, but it's far below conventional suburban ratios, especially for office space, which range anywhere from 2.8 to 4 or more spaces per 1,000 square feet. And also important to note that the parking consultant found that only 1,200 spaces are really needed for evening and weekend uses. So this leaves, during those times of the day and of the week, about 1,000 spaces vacant. So that suggests that more than 1,000 hotel rooms could be developed at the site with no additional spaces required. So again, it's clear that opportunities to build less parking can produce cost savings. But just quickly, what about the impacts, again, on affordable housing? Well, a study from last year of parking usage and affordable housing in Colorado's Front Range showed that for the properties they explored, only 1 unit out of every 12 utilized parking. And for the 883 parking spaces that were provided, half went unused at nearly all times. So this equates to an estimated cost of over $9 million on parking. That's in excess of demand, and that's roughly equivalent to the cost to build an entire 40 units of affordable housing. So since this study was published, the Denver City Council approved a change in the city's zoning code that reduces minimum parking requirements for affordable housing developments. And today, the new minimum parking ratio for affordable housing in any district in Denver is 1 spot for every 10 units. And this change came about due to studies like this and a push from various local advocacy groups. So on the theme of parking policy updates, how do they move forward and what's their impact? So going quickly back to Buffalo, which I mentioned previously, before they eliminated parking minimums citywide in 2017, public engagement surveys showed that, perhaps surprisingly, there was surprisingly strong support for reforms. So many public comments had centered on the negative impacts, actually, of the overabundance of surface parking lots and a desire to protect the walkability of the existing neighborhoods. So the city's planning team had previously considered moving toward a less significant change, but ultimately decided to repeal minimum parking requirements citywide after finding through their engagement that there was surprisingly little opposition to the policy change. And in terms of the results, it's still early, but a study from this year published in the Journal of the American Planning Association tracked 14 mixed-use projects in Buffalo that were developed since 2017. Across all 14, they provided 53% less parking than previously required. 4 projects built no parking at all. Other shared parking and transit-oriented development also increased. So just quickly before closing, I think it's really important to note that even with the questions about parking brought on by the pandemic, cities across the country continue to move forward with parking policy changes in 2021. South Bend and St. Paul abolished minimum parking requirements. Boston updated their maximum parking ratios just this month to right-size the amount of parking allowed for new large developments. And again, Dallas is now exploring updating their parking regulations for the first time in over 60 years with the goals of investing in quality of life and minimizing additional excess parking. So even without consensus on what's next for parking, I really am hopeful that strong leadership that we continue to see from a growing number of cities, from developers and investors, will produce more spaces for people instead of for car storage. So that's it for me. Thank you. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And now I'm going to hand it over to Chrissy. So Chrissy, take it away.
Chrissy, you're muted.
Of course. Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Becky and Urbanism Next for having me today. I'm Chrissy Mancini Nichols with Walker Consultants. I'm the National Director of Curb Management and New Mobility at Walker, based in San Francisco, but work across the country. If you're not familiar with Walker, we're a transportation, planning, and parking consulting firm. We work with cities, transit agencies, airports, developers, and others on transit and transportation planning and parking. And what I want to talk to you about today is a study that we've been working on over the past 3+ years that I'm leading. It's a curb management research study that's really vetting all of these new technology products out in the market for curb management and working with 5 cities to collect curb use data and plan for their curbs. So why is everyone talking about curb management? Well, as we know, curbs are one of the most expensive and valuable assets in a city, but they're also a community space and they're the public realm. And, you know, when I worked in Chicago, we talked about how curbs and the right-of-way was 30% of all the city held and managed land. You know, that was a very prime asset. It's not just a piece of concrete. It can encourage, the curbs can really encourage behavioral changes and how people get around and how we provide access and how we think about equitably providing access. And what we saw with the pandemic is what we needed for our curbs during the pandemic really has merged with ongoing trends. So pre-COVID, there was already all this demand for curb space. And then with the pandemic, we had to think about how to use that finite space to help business, to protect public health, to provide short-term loading for pickups and parklets for outdoor dining. And we saw that cities were able to take fast action to respond there. But we're also seeing with COVID was this convergence in revenues related to the curb. You know, pre-2019, we had already begun looking at parking demand trends and thinking about how parking revenues, you know, over the next 10 to 15 years would likely decline because of the changing demands for parking and for on-street curb space. And then that converged with COVID-19, where we saw this huge drop in parking revenues. So that's where we're now starting this even broader conversation about who we should charge for access to the curb and what that looks like. And then I also wanted to mention, just building on what Matt was talking about, when we talk about parking minimums, we have to have curb management strategies in place with any reduction in or change in off-street parking minimums so that we don't have all of the spillover onto the streets. You know, that's very critical. So this is just the very, very high level planning process that we undertake during a full-fledged curb management study. You know, this is a presentation on its own, but I just wanted to lay out the steps here and highlight one of them, which is when you manage your curbs, you know, we talk about there's a curb management journey and cities are on different aspects of that journey. Some are just starting out with parking regulations and maybe having hourly minimums. Others are further along and they're testing commercial loading zone pilots and TNC pickup and drop-offs and TNC per ride fees. You know, what works here in San Francisco with demand-based pricing with SF Park might not work in another city. You know, there's a lot of resources and investment in technology to do all of these things. So we want to think about curb management as part of the local context and what you need locally based on your community's needs, but also looking to the future and thinking about how the curb can work to achieve all of your citywide mobility and access and equity goals. So getting into the study, one of the biggest things that we were hearing from cities was vendors are approaching us about curb management products. We don't, have a way to vet some of these products. So we wanted to go out and vet some of these products, but we also wanted to collect data because when we were working on, for example, curb access fees and monetization of the curb, we didn't have a lot of good data to work with to project revenues or to figure out how much space we can allocate. So what we wanted to do was go out, we're working in 5 cities to collect data. And as part of that process, we're vetting a lot, all of the technology. So we are, as a function of that, our goal is to create universal typologies for the curb, based on adjacent land uses, all the dwell time data we're collecting to say, well, we know if you have a commercial area with this types of land use, you need this many ride app pickup and drop off spaces, or this many commercial loading zones. These are the dwell times we can expect. And we're basing some of this off on modeling we've done with airports to design ride app areas that I'll show you a little bit later. And then we're also evaluating, there's what I love is all the policy issues that are involved with the curb. There's lots of partnerships, agreements, future revenue sharing, lots of details to sort out over the long term. So we're evaluating all of those issues as well. I mentioned that part of our study is vetting and testing technology. There's a lot of new technology out there, and we have a parking technology practice that we're sort of aligning that with all of the work we do to vet parking technology. We're looking at how are these different companies, some are new, what are the products they offer? We're testing them to see how accurate they are, doing a lot of due diligence around that. And just want to note that all this technology for curb management, it really exists on a spectrum. There are products out there that will inventory your curbs, creating visualizations and mapping and inventorying all the regulations so that you can make those changes, within a platform. There are products that promise to be able to monitor and enforce the curb. So they, eventually want to read a license plate within a geofenced area so that you can monetize the curb. Some of those products we have begun testing, they're in the early stages, but we expect that the technology will evolve. So one of the first cities that we worked with was the city of Sarasota, Florida, with Mark Lyons there, who's the parking manager. And Sarasota had been experiencing a lot of curb issues downtown on Main Street on Lemon Avenue, which is downtown commercial core. There historically have been a lot of transportation network companies or Uber and Lyft or ride apps that were picking up and dropping off by double parking. And what this did was just have a cascading effect that private vehicles would see the ride apps double parking, so they would double park. And then the commercial delivery vehicles would double park or block the alleys. And there was this need to figure out, well, we need more pedestrian and bike space. We have potentially safety issues with all this double parking and traffic congestion issues. So how can we create a holistic plan for curb management? So what we did was we went out and we set cameras up over 24 days. We positioned 16 cameras in 78 parking spaces, which we vetted several camera technology companies to collect data because this, our goal was to collect data on all of the curb use activity. And we ended up working with a company called Beta. Let's see if this video is working here, sorry. And we, the technology is part of our research study. So we were able to collect data every 10 seconds. We manually reviewed all of the images and we labeled them. Over this 3-week period, we collected 13 million data points. And I'll get into some of that. From the data points, we created a dashboards because that was really critical in being able to analyze the data and, especially for the city staff. And we also reviewed all of the parking meter transaction to compare. And this is the study area here, which is downtown Sarasota. And then we did look at an area over here, which is behind a grocery store. We wanted to look at commercial loading here. There was a private loading dock. And then these red areas are alleys behind Main Street. So these alleys have a lot of commercial delivery activity and staging in them. So what we found was it's a highly utilized system, but also there were a lot of under 15-minute parking sessions on Main Street, which was a surprise to the city because when we compared what we found in our video data to the parking meter transaction data, that did not come up in the parking meter transaction data. And we figured that some of the reason is because the first 10 minutes are free of charge to park in Sarasota, but also maybe because people just aren't paying the meter if they're parking for less than 15 minutes, hoping they don't get a citation. So, you know, that's some comparison. When you have the video data, you get more precise data. And we also found, as expected, commercial activities have much lower dwell times. The pickup and drop off activities had much lower dwell times. We were able to look at data by the vehicle type, vehicle color, so we could really narrow down what types of vehicles were parking or performing any activity at the curb. So I mentioned that Main Street, 30% of the sessions had dwell times of 15 minutes or less, and that didn't come up in the parking transaction data. The rest of the dwell times on Main Street, the other 70% did skew longer, 1 to 2 hours. And a pretty large amount of vehicles are parked on Main Street for 2 to 4 hours. What does that mean? We also found shortest dwell times in the areas for the no parking areas, where we saw a lot of TNC pickup and drop off, and the alleys had a lot of commercial delivery activity. So what does this mean for curb management? So on Main Street, this is the commercial district. You don't want people parking here for 2 to 4 hours. Then spaces aren't turning over. It does suggest the need for more short-term spaces, and then we're working on the opportunity to move the longer-term spaces, longer-term parking needs to a nearby garage. There's potential to use different pricing schemes or creating more of a mobility hub facility within that garage with a shuttle service, so that you get those long-term parkers off of the street and you save that short-term parking on the street for the quick pick turnover, getting people in and out of businesses, getting their takeout. And then, you have more of a functional on-street system. We found that also there were many areas that were no parking. So for example, this is Lemon Street, and you can see it corresponds to the map here. These areas are no parking, no standing, regulated, but we found about 40 non-parking violations per day, mostly during lunch and dinner, all passenger vehicles. And that, it was all ride out, pickup and drop offs. And, this Lemon Street it's an area where it's not a super wide right of way. This is what it looks like on, the street. So you could see there's been a lot of investment because it's actually, a nicely paved street, lots of sidewalk space. You want to preserve that for either comfortable walking environments. You don't want lots of double parking or traffic congestion because there's all this pickup and drop off activity happening on this street, and it's backing up traffic because it's backing up either to the stop sign or there's a traffic signal on the other side. So that was also an insight, because the city can now say we want to focus more enforcement on this street now that we know there's all of this activity occurring that is not regulated. And again, the commercial deliveries were really using the alleys during weekday business hours. I'll get into some of this, but we found that the alleys had a lot more capacity to accommodate more use because of the data we were able to analyze. So we also worked with the city of Sacramento, Matt Ironman, and the city was hearing complaints about TNC pickup and drop-offs in this area here. There's a hospital over here. So they had both ride-up pickup and drop-offs and private vehicle pickup and drop-offs, but it was all anecdotal. But the city was getting complaints about this. And so what we tested was, well, let's see if we move, this was all paid on-street parking longer term. And the city of Sacramento has tiered parking, so the longer you stay, the rate goes up per hour to encourage turnover. But it is a revenue source. And several years ago, we worked with the city to work on a financing mechanism that built an arena backed up by parking revenue. So it's a very important revenue source. So what we did was we moved these parking spaces to short-term pickup and drop off. And then we used public cameras. We wanted to test video analytic products. So we had a public camera facing this area, and then we sent that public video to a video analytics company to, give us the data back and the information. We also manually reviewed all the data against what the video analytics company sent us to make sure it was accurate. And we did this in July of 2021 over a 6-day period. We logged passenger pickup and drop off, commercial delivery activity, parking, dwell times. And so what we found was really interesting in that we heard this anecdotal data, but the data that we collected via the cameras did not show what we were hearing anecdotally. There was still just a lot of parking still going on. There were some pickup and drop offs, but people were still parking in those areas longer term, even though it was regulated for short-term parking. And though we didn't find that there was activity related to pickup and drop off, it was a really important finding that people were still parking here because, as I said, Sacramento has their parking revenues back up city debt, and we want to make sure that those revenues are stable. So we then can move those spaces back to long-term parking and look for other areas for pickup and drop off. We also wanted to test manual data collection. We had heard from lots of cities. We know that the administrative resources or the funding resources to collect in all of this using cameras and all of this technology to collect data, can be really challenging. So we wanted to try manual data collection. We worked with the city of Noblesville, Indiana, in their commercial area over a four block study area. This is an area that has parking. It does have a lot of short-term pickup, short-term spaces, so that they implemented short-term spaces and moved from long-term to short-term during COVID to allow for pickup and drop-offs. But there's no scooter share or bike share, transit. There's not a lot of we didn't record any ride-up activity. So it's really just parking and commercial delivery. And so we went out and manually tried to collect this data. And it was really challenging. We had staff out on every block, and we had very well organized data sheets that we were recording. The staff were on each block. They were recording occupancy every 15 minutes. They were recording dwell times for commercial deliveries and for parking. And it's not impossible with enough staffing, but I think it's very challenging to do manual data collection of all the different curb use activity unless you have a lot of eyes on the block. And if you had an area where there were a lot of different uses, a lot of TNC pickup and drop offs or scooter, then you would need even more staff to collect dwell times and occupancy. Because as we know, this ride up, pickup and drop off happens in less than a minute. So you need a lot of eyes on the ground to do that. But what was interesting in the findings we collected was that even in a city that's it's a commercial, there's a pretty nice sized commercial area, a lot of activity. But Noblesville isn't a huge town, but we saw that the spaces that were the short-term loading spaces, they were turning over constantly. They had dwell times of less than 5 minutes, and even during the peak use, they were turning over, 3 times every 15 minutes. It was really interesting to see all this activity because so many people were either going to pick up lunch or coffee or dinner. Again, the 2-hour spaces, they were pretty much full the entire day. but didn't really turn over. People were still parking in them all day, and Noblesville doesn't really enforce the regulation. I'll add that. So, people know that they can pretty much get away with parking at the curb all day. But I think what it showed was there is this need for more short-term spaces that we'll probably see even post-COVID, this need for more short-term spaces. So I want to just talk for a minute about the data and the data collection. So we typically collect curb use data for parking at a point in time. So a point in time on the hour. So usually we walk a block. If we're doing this manually, we'll walk a block at 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m., noon, and we'll collect the occupancy data. We'll say this area was 80% occupied at this point in time. And that may be just accurate enough for what we needed in the past. But with all the new activity, with pickup and drop-offs happening in less than a minute, commercial delivery happening, many times across the hour, we really needed the camera or some other technology product to collect this continuous data across the hour and really get more precise data. That's why we collected over 13 million data points over those 3 weeks in Sarasota alone, because we were able to capture everything. And what was interesting we found is when we analyzed the data, we took a look at it and compared the activity over the hour. So for every minute across the hour, 60 points in time. And then we compared it to the hour data, which is 1 point in time. So we found that when we looked across the hour, we thought the areas, for example, the alleys in Sarasota were more occupied than they actually were when we looked across at the minute data. You'll see, so at 2 p.m. here, if we just looked at this point in time, 2 p.m. on this day, and this is averaged across the entire 3-week data collection period. So at 2 p.m., this alley was almost over 80%, almost 90% occupied. We would have thought that that alley was highly utilized at that point in time. There's no space there for any more capacity. It's fully maximized. But when we went back and looked at all of the data across that hour at 2 p.m. and how delivery vehicles were coming and going, we actually found it was only about 40% occupied. There was actually a lot more capacity there when we looked across the entire hour. So that precise data will really help us plan for how we use the space. And if there are additional capacities, we think there are a lot more capacity probably in areas where there are these quick turnovers for either commercial delivery or pickup and drop off. Then if we just went every hour on the hour and collected a point in time data, we would miss all of that. So some of the findings are on the slide here. Again, we found a high number of short-term stays no matter the city size. On the technology, there can be long lead times. So for example, with all of these cities so far, we've worked for several months pre-setting the cameras up with several vendors to walk through the installation process, which was all part of our vetting of the technology in real life. There were a lot of challenges that we had to overcome. I mean, I won't get into all of them, but you can just imagine plugging into power, coordinating across city departments with the power company, figuring out, do we need continuous data or can we capture pictures every 10 seconds? Are there trees in the way? That was a huge challenge to overcome. What are the sight lines? Do we need to change out SD cards every couple days? Can we use solar cameras? And is there public Wi-Fi so that we can transmit the data? I mean, those were just a few of the challenges that we overcame, and we ended up using for Sarasota, a solar powered, easily mountable camera that really worked well. We also created a dashboard. That took a while to create that dashboard and figure out out of this 13 million data points, what do we really want to show? And I think all of these processes are getting better. This is all a learning process for everyone working in curb management. So I think with more and more cities working on these plans and collecting data, we're learning from all of them, and that will continue to improve. And I'll also note the administrative time that on the cities that it takes. This is a lot of resources across several departments, and just not included in the study, but I just worked with the city of Benicia to create their parklet and streetery program, which we moved from a temporary program to a permanent program. We worked on the regulations, the design standards, and what was really important out of that was creating a very simple guide and process for the city departments to understand what are their specific responsibilities when we want to build a parklet. What does the development review process look like? What are the design guidelines? And then the public and business can understand that too. So creating a guidebook for the public with very clear, processes is critical. When you're dealing with curb management, there are lots of operators, businesses, departments to work across. And having this like instituting curb management and operationalizing it across city departments, we often can lose sight in that like nitty gritty stuff when we're talking about all the technology and data, but that's really critical to make it work for the long term. And then longer term, this is some of the work we've been doing on mobility hubs. And as I mentioned, there's opportunities to transition off-street parking facilities, like the off-street parking to periphery parking, and co-locating transit, shuttle stops, bike and car share, even having commercial delivery activities there, especially if, like we've seen a lot of parking garages even on the periphery if they're underutilized, and that leaves more space at the curb for more people-centered activities that will maximize the value of that asset. This is a passenger loading zone that we designed in what was formerly a parking garage. And what we do, we've gone out, and here's some of our modeling that we've completed for these different designs. We actually went out and collected data on TN's ride-out, pickup, and drop-offs, looking at dwell times, and then we use that data to inform our models. And we use these for both on and off street designs for passenger loading, but this one, let's see if we can get it moving. But you can see what happens here when you have, like, depending on the amount of space you have, the single stacked vehicle can easily back up, which is not unexpected, because as one person, we know if a person's having trouble getting in the vehicle, or even say the driver gets out and opens the trunk. I mean, we really collected data on not just the dwell times, but user behavior. So we found, like, if a driver gets out and opens the trunk or opens the door, that can significantly impact the dwell time. And if you're in a single stacked design, these cars are all going to back up and you'll have some congestion. We also looked at how do pedestrians access vehicles. This pull through in the bottom right corner here was one of the most efficient designs, but it also helps with sight lines and safety. So this is just some of the design modeling we've completed for pickup and drop off spaces. And then lastly, talking about curb management fees, we get a lot of questions about this, and I'm working with some cities on their monetization right now. We want to think about fees as an important revenue source, not just to, think about, well, some of the parking demand that might decline to make up for some of that lost revenue, but, how do we charge for ride apps, delivery, dockless vehicles? How do we charge for short-term stays? And use that funding to invest in more mobility infrastructure and more access. So one thing to note is, this idea of this geofence location where we're charging based on the time of day, that's not really happening right now. I think we'll get to that, but fees, like any policy, implementing them, it's a very incremental process. And as the technology and policy evolves, we'll be able to get to what I would think is a curb congestion-based pricing, very similar to tolling on highways. But right now, we're working with fees starting with a ride out per ride fee, metering commercial delivery zones, or creating a commercial delivery permit fee, And then as we collect data, work on the policy, work through council, work with technology, we can move to a curb congestion pricing, in this geofenced area when, eventually we can collect license plate data and have all the agreements in place with operators to do so. There's also regulatory hurdles to overcome in implementing fees. So for example, in California, you have to go through voter approval. Some states regulate how locals can implement fees. So there's, state requirements that you also need to work through. And then lastly, on the policy considerations, I would just stress flexibility and regulations as we create these frameworks, and flexibility is really important so that you can pilot areas, when you're writing regulations, having the broad ability to pilot and test is critically important. And then I also know I've worked on a lot of public-private partnerships. And so as you're thinking about fees and working with the private sector and companies to, collect data, or, there's lots of discussions on long-term revenue agreements, there's a lot of considerations on who has control of the data, use of the curb, the rights to set rates, how long is the agreement. I worked on the renegotiation of the Chicago parking meter concession, and that public-private partnership was really detrimental to what Chicago could do in terms of building bus rapid transit, having a street festival. It essentially gave away its rights to the curb. So we want to make sure that we're not implementing these 75-year agreements that, we don't know what's going to happen in 5 years or next year, let alone 75 years. So we want to ensure that curb space remains in the public realm. And then two of the current projects we are studying right now, we're working with 2 cities looking at moving curbs from parking to parklets and parking and travel lane to bus and bike lane. And then we'll create those universal curb typologies after we collect all our data file. And there's lots of resources available. I'll add this link in the chat, and thanks again.
Chrissy, thank you so much. Matt, if you could join us as well. There's a lot of great questions, and I know we won't quite get to it. We just have a few minutes left. That was definitely really fascinating from both of you. And so I just want to pose just a quick question from both, and it's something that on some of our projects we've been kind of struggling with as well, but it's really understanding that demand and the most important metrics for local jurisdictions to understand as they're thinking about their programs or working with, excuse me, the companies themselves. And so Matt, I'm just going to start with you. Definitely developers are paying attention to that occupancy and, what is the demand? What's the maximum amount of parking that, the developers really need to provide? Is occupancy the right metric? And how are they thinking of kind of off-street accommodating the deliveries or shorter term parking, or even a little bit more of the hub uses? What do you think going forward is going to be the most important?
Yeah, I think occupancy is an important metric, right? Because it shows that we have so much more parking than is being utilized. And, structural shifts, remain to be seen long-term with, what's going to happen with, return to going back to offices. Yeah, I think before Delta variant, it was a little bit surprising how quickly it looked like in many markets, the, office market was rebounding. But at the same time, studies show that it's really only about a quarter of us that really on a day-to-day basis can work from home or will be working from home. So, yeah, so, to answer your questions, I think, I really am hearing, just generally more and more, an understanding that whether it's public sector folks or developers or investors, just understanding how much extra parking that we have available, and just a growing understanding that building more is not the solution, and we'll never be able to tackle our huge issues with housing affordability, sustainability, really the issues of today, by continuing to build excess parking.
All right, and Chrissy, I'm just going to ask you kind of one last question, and it's related to those metrics as well as the dashboard, and really understanding what's the story the data is telling us. And I thought it was fascinating to see, you know, the analysis of the by minute versus by hour. You know, what are the cities themselves really gravitating towards as kind of the most important metrics that they're paying attention to?
Well, I think cities are looking at occupancy data, of course, but we really need to look at dwell time data. It's not enough just to look at occupancy. We need to know how long these vehicles are sitting there. And I'm seeing some questions in the chat on parking. Parking is still the biggest use of the curb, even in New York City. You know, parking has driven the curb space. It's very difficult to move from parking to non-parking uses. So showing people turnover, you know, those are some of the things that can work with making the case for making these changes. So if you can talk about, I believe it was in Boston, one of their passenger loading zone pilots, they were looking at 3 cars per hour versus 14 people because they moved from parking to pick up and drop off. So that's for, you know, 11 more people that gain access to those businesses each hour. So I think collecting that data can be helpful in making those changes.
That's wonderful. I feel like I've learned so much from both of you. We are at the top of the hour, so I just wanted to thank you both for joining us today. And I will be putting the recording online as well as the presentations. And so I'll send out a message to all of the people that registered for the webinar. And so you will get that over the next week or so. Chrissy, Matt, thank you both again.
Thank you, Becky.
Thank you. Yeah, and please be in touch. We want to keep collaborating with all of you. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Bye-bye.